So again, what I'm struck by is the gap between all these global challenges and global arrangements. You know, one of the phrases you constantly hear is people say, well, the international community has to do something. Well, the deep, dark secret, the cold, hard truth is there is no international community. There should be one. It'd be great if there were one that agreed on what to do and was willing to do it. But in the meantime, we're stuck with a world where these global challenges are coming at us, and in many cases, our responses are woefully inadequate.
Greetings to everyone. Hello, I'm Mary Eintema, the President and CEO of World Boston, and I am here to welcome you to today's Chat and Chowder program featuring Richard Haass in his new book, The World, A Brief Introduction. As you may know, the mission of World Boston is to foster engagement in international affairs and global cooperation. Even though we're at home, and maybe even especially while we're at home, we really believe that while our programs may change, this mission persists. So I hope you'll learn more about World Boston at worldboston.org. And now we all want to get to it, and I do mean all. We have close to 300 people registered to join us tonight from Greater Boston and beyond. And I mean beyond, from Oklahoma, from Barcelona, and even from Beijing. So it is a very great pleasure to introduce Dr. Richard Haass. His bio is remarkable, and I encourage you to read it in full at worldboston.org, where we also have a link to purchase the book, which I can show you if I'm on. I'm not sure if we're still on a slide. I will show you. Oh yes, here we are. The book, which you should purchase at the link that we have from the Harvard Bookstore. I'll just note in brief that Dr. Haass has headed the Council on Foreign Relations since 2003. Prior to that, he served as Senior Middle East Advisor to President H.W. Bush and as the Director of Policy Planning Staff at the State Department under Colin Powell. He succeeded Senator George Mitchell as the U.S. Special Envoy for Northern Ireland and was Vice President at the Brookings Institution. He's a recipient of the Presidential Citizens Medal, the State Department's Distinguished Honor Award, and the Tipperary International Peace Award. He's also the author or editor of 14 books. So, Dr. Haass, we are thrilled to have you tonight to talk about the world. I understand you're going to start us off with some remarks, and then we'll move on to questions. So, welcome to World Boston.
Well, thank you, Mary. It's good to be back with a connection to Boston. I spent 4 years living there when I taught at the Kennedy School. Mm-hmm. And since I'm not stupid, much more important, I got married there to a girl from Allington. And the rest, as they say, is history. So tonight, what I wanted to do is talk about the world, 1 or 2 minutes about the book, mostly about the real thing, the actual world. But I think the reason I wrote this book is useful to begin with. And the reason is quite simple. You know, we're living through COVID. Other times, on 9/11, we were affected by a bunch of terrorists who had trained in Afghanistan. Every day we are affected by the implications and the consequences of climate change. And the short bottom line is the world matters. Nothing stays local for long anymore. Yet, the knowledge that most people in this country, I'll focus on Americans, but it also applies to other countries, the knowledge that people have is there's a remarkable gap between the objective importance of the world and what people know about it, and also what people should know about it. I'm still a believer in the Jeffersonian notion of an informed citizenry. This November, we're going to vote. Given how much influence the president has over U.S. foreign policy, given how much influence what the United States does and doesn't do in the world has on the world, and then through that on the United States, I think it's essential that when people cast their vote, they think about the issues and the positions of the candidate. One has to be aware, knowledgeable to do that. Any number of business decisions, career decisions, personal decisions, investment decisions, all require a degree of knowledge about the world. We want to be in a position to hold our elected representatives to account. And the problem is you can graduate from Harvard or Stanford or Yale, and if you navigate those course requirements in a personal way, you can effectively graduate being functionally illiterate. about the world you will enter. And just think, is anyone graduating from school now, he or she is essentially going to live a life that's going to track the 21st century. And I'm struck by how many graduates of our colleges and universities simply know very, very little. So they're in many ways illiterate when it comes to knowledge and understanding of the world. It obviously applies to high school because most high schools aren't even able to offer the courses. Obviously, lots of people do not go to college and university. If you tune on the evening news on the networks, you will be hard-pressed to find anything serious or substantive about the world. There's tons of stuff on the internet. The problem is there's tons of stuff on the internet. Most of it is a lot of it is inaccurate. It's very hard to know what to believe, what not to believe, again, without a foundation. And that's the purpose of this book, to give people a foundation so they can navigate all that's coming at them, so they can better fulfill the obligations of citizenship. This book is not an argument like my previous books. I'm not trying to sell you people on a certain foreign policy, what to do here or there. But there are two biases in the book, just to put my cards on the table. One is that the world matters, that isolationism, denial are folly, that these oceans that surround us are not moats. So again, the world will affect us. So we might as well, again, be smart about it. And second of all, there's nothing that this or any other country can do in the world better by itself than it can do with others. So essentially, I have very little enthusiasm, to say the least, for isolationism. I have very little enthusiasm, to say the least, for unilateralism. I believe we need to be involved in the world. And again, we ought to do it with others collaboratively, to the extent possible, multilaterally. That is essentially the argument here. Why I think it's so necessary now, and let me segue, is three things. One is we're at a point in history where it's 30 years after the end of the Cold War. And what we are seeing is a lot of the optimism was proven wrong. It's not the end of history, to say the least. And what we're seeing in many ways is the revival of history, whether it's Russian animosity to many things and the clear revival of a US-Russia, a lot of friction there. Even more so of late with China, or rising China. And the question is, how will the two most powerful countries of this era, will they be able to get along? The consequences are profound. So my point is, one thing is that we're living in a moment where a lot of the traditional stuff of history, the traditional stuff of foreign policy is reemerging. And as we've learned historically, that can have tremendous consequences. Secondly, what's so interesting about this era of history is not simply the revival of what you might call the old-fashioned stuff of history, but it's the newfangled stuff as well. Again, here we are with infectious disease. What began in Wuhan didn't stay in Wuhan. We've got climate change, a growing reality. And if you've been reading the papers the last few days, the consequences for the amount of territory in the world that will be inhabitable. That territory is shrinking. This will cause many people to move, not by choice, but by necessity. Have all sorts of consequences for disease, potentially also for conflict. 9/11, we had that experience. So we've got all these global challenges, cyberspace, we've got Russians interfering in our elections. And what strikes me in every one of these areas, and I could list others, trade and so forth, is that there's an enormous gap between the objective importance of these global issues, many of which are simply manifestations of globalization, these enormous flows across borders. And there's an enormous gap between the scale of the flows, the importance of the issues, and the willingness and ability of the world to come together to deal with them. Cyberspace is so instrumental to our lives, and it's essentially anarchic. There's virtually no rules, and there's no ability to enforce the few rules that there are. In global health, we've seen the limits and weaknesses, first in terms of what China didn't do, not meeting its obligations. The World Health Organization is not strong enough. Now you have, 150 efforts around the world to produce a vaccine, but there's no consensus in the world about what to do if and when a vaccine were to emerge. Who gets it in what order? Where is it produced? Who pays for it? and so forth. North Korea, meanwhile, is continuing to build nuclear weapons and missiles. Iran is pushing up against the edges of the 2015 agreement. More than 1 out of every 100 persons in the world is either a refugee or internally displaced. So again, what I'm struck by is the gap between all these global challenges and global arrangements. You know, one of the phrases you constantly hear is people say, well, the international community has to do something. Well, the deep, dark secret, the cold, hard truth is there is no international community. There should be one. It'd be great if there were one that agreed on what to do and was willing to do it. But in the meantime, we're stuck with a world where these global challenges are coming at us, and in many cases, our responses are woefully inadequate. So what we've got on one hand, the old challenges that have reemerged, we've got this whole set of new challenges. And then on top of it, and I think this is critical, is we have a United States that's increasingly uncertain and unsure as to what its role is going to be. For 70, 75 years since the end of World War II, the United States has been the most powerful and the most influential country in the world. We've been the architect and the general contractor of global arrangements, both setting them up and making them work. But beginning with the end of the Obama administration and then accelerating dramatically in this administration, we have evidence that the United States is essentially has lost its appetite for that role. And lots of reasons why. I think most of them are mistaken, that it costs too much, or we don't need to do this, or that these arrangements have hurt us. The truth is, it doesn't cost that much. The benefits dwarf the what costs there are. As we're learning, we're not immune. We can't isolate ourselves from the consequences. But no matter, that is the direction and drift of American foreign policy. And this administration, you've seen a serial withdrawal from one international arrangement after another, questioning about the alliance system. That's been one of the bedrocks of the world. Real criticism of trade agreements, and in many cases without much being suggested or put in its place. And my point is simply that the world will not be able to get closer to meeting all of its global challenges without the United States playing a leading role, but increasingly we seem to have very little interest in doing so. So it's this combination of these three phenomena, the emergence of the old agenda, the emergence of a new agenda, and the United States that's lost a lot of its appetite for playing a large role in the world, that has created the condition that we're increasingly seeing, which is a world that is increasingly, to use a word out of my last book, in disarray. And I think, again, the lesson of recent history is we cannot inoculate ourselves, to use a medical term of the moment, from the consequences of that disarray in the world. And we're into a bad, almost feedback loop. The United States is doing less in the world. It's doing less with others. The world is beginning to unravel. And as the world unravels, things here at home get worse, which then leads us to think we've got to pay more attention to things at home. We need to put aside the world. The problem is there's no time out. The world doesn't basically say to the United States, yeah, you Americans go sort things out at home for a few years, and when you're ready, come back to us. There's no pause button out there. Things continue to unravel. And again, that will have all sorts of implications for us. So it is a serious moment. It's not all bad. I'm happy to talk about the things that I see some positives. So you don't have to hit the martinis quite yet. I understand that I can be quite negative, but I do think there are grounds for being concerned. To be blunt, if you're not worried, you're not paying attention. You ought to be worried, because the world doesn't just organize itself. Good things in history don't just happen. That's not the natural default option of history. It takes involvement, it takes effort. And again, the United States has been critical to this for 70, 75 years. On balance, it's worked tremendously for us. There hasn't been any great power war. The average person in this country lives more than a decade longer than would have been the case 3 decades ago. The standard of living in this and other countries has gone up astronomically. The amount of people living under democracies have gone up dramatically. This has been a real era of human progress. And I think what's happened of late is we've taken it for granted, and I don't want its disappearance to be the wake-up call, because by then it's too late. So again, returning to why I wrote the book, is I want people to understand the inherent importance of what goes on out there for here, and the importance of what we do here for what happens out there. So Mary, why don't I stop with that? I will not perform a Washington filibuster. And instead, I'd love to hear people's comments and questions.
Okay, so as I said, we do have some that came in ahead of time, and I'm actually I'm going to steal a mic and ask you the first question myself. I mean, obviously, you know, we're doing this on Zoom for a reason, right? We are in kind of the most global situation you could imagine right now. How is an effective response characterized by global cooperation? I mean, why do we need the world to respond? I mean, right now we're working state to state, and by the way, you're virtually in a state that's doing really well with its response. So could this be, you know, proof positive that the liberal world order is beneficial and required?
Look, national security, think of it as a coin. And this is a coin, like all coins, with two sides. There's an international dimension and a domestic dimension. So part of the necessary response to this global challenge called COVID-19 and the pandemic it set off is domestic. And that gets into everything like masks and social distancing and hygiene, contact tracing, all the things you've seen or haven't seen. And what we've seen is enormous variety or variation across national lines, from the success stories in Germany, to some extent South Korea, New Zealand, Australia, what have you, Taiwan. And we've seen the failures in this country, Brazil. We've also seen failures in places like Russia, India, Iran. What's so interesting is neither the successes nor the failures line up to types of political systems. It's all about leadership. Good leadership, whether it's in Vietnam or Germany, country has weathered the storm remarkably well. Lousy leadership in other countries, you can figure them out for yourselves. They've paid an enormous human and political price. So part of the answer is national to this. That's the domestic side of the coin. The other side of the coin is the international. China did not meet certain of its reporting obligations under the international health regulations, but the problem is there's no enforcement mechanism. The World Health Organization gets its funding and gets its staff appointments through the UN. In a funny sort of way, it's like a referee in a tennis match, scared to call a ball out because the players control who the referees are. So the World Health Organization has a little bit of that problem, but we are where we are. That's more for the future. That has to be hopefully remedied, or we need new institutions. The real question now is what happens if and when not answers, but things like vaccines, therapeutics begin to emerge. They're not panaceas, but they're obviously really useful tools. Well, we got 8 billion people in the world. If it's a 2-dose vaccine, that's 16 billion doses. Who's going to produce it? Who's going to pay for it? Who's going to decide who gets where in the queue? Does it all depend upon where it's produced, where it's invented? Is it the countries that can pay for it? None of this has been sorted out. So we're in a crisis in part because international cooperation has been inadequate. Even if things come along that could help us get out of the crisis, what worries me is they're not going to have the effect they should because international cooperation remains woefully inadequate. Now we've got time. The vaccine's not going to emerge tonight, but I'm struck by the lack of international momentum towards coming up with the rules of the road, shall we say, for how to deal with vaccine. To put it bluntly, and I wrote a piece about this the other day, I'm worried about, rather than seeing vaccine multilateralism, I think we could see vaccine nationalism.
Well, actually, that, and I will, we've got a couple of hands up, but that actually is another question of mine, which you touch on in the book a bit. But how can it be in this, and they're linked, how can it be in this time of increasing globalization and in such a very global moment that we also see, not just in the US, but all over, many of us think about Europe, but the rise of nationalism? Why is it those two things are happening at the same time?
We're seeing things like populism and nationalism. I think there's lots of reasons. It's what, 12, 13 years since the financial crisis. And even before that, but certainly after that, an awful lot of people around the world have seen their real incomes drift at best, go down at worst. That's one reason. I think there's a sense for many people that migration flows, and things coming across borders, culture, and all that are somehow a threat. A lot of people feel insecure, feel threatened. New technologies have come along that have eliminated a lot of existing jobs. The education and skill requirements for the jobs that technology are created are a lot more demanding. A lot of people are getting caught in that skills gap. But they're blaming it on trade rather than blaming it on or attributing it to technology and then doing something about it. You have leaders obviously exploiting these concerns. I think what's happening with COVID is a nasty overlay on this because it's exacerbated dramatically, among other things, the economic problems that a lot of people are feeling. But I also think, coming back to what I said before, performance matters. So in a lot of ways, poor performance of COVID, if you have a leader who's populist, he or she's going to be vulnerable if they don't deliver. Mm-hmm. And if you have a leader who's not populist and they deliver, they'll do fine. So again, I think there'll be a little bit of a political churn coming out of this, depending upon how well the status quo performs.
Okay, great, thank you. So we have a question from Leslie Griffin, one of our wonderful World Boston board members. Go ahead, Leslie, can we pull you in?
I thought it was really interesting, your comment about, we need the international community to do something, but there isn't an international community. And it relates to a question I wanted to ask you about sort of the degree of community that exists with regard to sort of our challenges with China, because we hear all the time, we should be working with our allies to face our shared challenges with China, but instead we're antagonizing them at every turn. But it seems that it takes more than just a set of shared grievances to form an effective coalition for action. And we know even among our allies, like in Europe, there are some fence sitters on China. There are countries that have different levels of economic dependence with China and might prefer different ways to go about these challenges. Can you just speak about some of the practical challenges, even if we were in a Biden administration scenario where, with a greater openness to working with allies, to tackling our challenges with China? Thanks very much.
It's a really interesting question. I've spent the last few days dealing with nothing but China ever since Mr. Pompeo's speech, and I made the decision to write a criticism of it. Look, a lot of countries out there are dependent for their security on us, but have large economic ties with China. And at the end of the day, they want to avoid making a fundamental choice of one or the other. What they'd like to do is be able to keep certain economic ties with China, at the same time maintain their security closeness or proximity with the United States. And so they're going to be extraordinarily reluctant to choose. That's one thing. Second of all, they'll do more of what we want if we are seen as being supportive. So when the United States decided not to enter the Trans-Pacific Partnership in the first week of this administration, that sent a powerful message to countries that were in China's neighborhood. At some point, weaker countries really have two choices because they really can't stand up to a China on their own. So they've either got to defer to China or they have to find security partners. We have provided the security partnership, but if we spend our time bashing our allies over how much they're willing to spend, or if we threaten to pull troops out of South Korea, if we unilaterally make the decision to pull some of our troops out of Germany, if we're reluctant to reaffirm our commitment to the basic Article 5 of NATO, that sends certain messages. Or if we don't want countries to get economically intimate with China in the next phase of broadband with 5G, but we don't have an alternative, as we used to say at the Kennedy School, it's hard to beat something with nothing. So again, we've got to go about this, I think, in a relatively nuanced way, but there's a lot of concern about China right now. There is concern about property theft. There's concern about privacy. There's obviously concern about what's going on in Hong Kong. There's a degree of concern, as there should be, about what the Chinese are doing with the Uyghurs. Obvious concern in the region about Chinese assertiveness, or worse, in the South China Sea. They've been doing certain things to intimidate some of their neighbors, like India, like Taiwan. So I think there's a readiness to push back against China. but only if the United States is seen as serious and consistent and steadfast. And I would say we have run hot and cold on dealing with China, and more broadly, we've run hot and cold on dealing with our allies, and I think it's made it much more difficult. Indeed, I thought it was quite stunning, or revealing, choose your word, in Mr. Pompeo's speech on Thursday at the Nixon Library. He called for greater pressure on China, but then he called out Germany, was very rough there, and didn't talk about things like the TPP, didn't address issues like American threats to withdraw troops. We got to be consistent here. Consistency is an important attribute for a great power, as is predictability, as is reliability. And otherwise, I think we're going to have trouble organizing the kind of collective effort against China. One other thing, there's always going to be limits, though, to that collective effort. As I said, people don't want to choose. There's going to be zero enthusiasm in the region for signing on to an American policy of regime change to essentially bring down the Chinese Communist Party, as the Secretary of State seems to want to do. So I think we've got to think about both the ends and means of our policy, and we can't just hatch it unilaterally. Consultations are one of the most important things in foreign policy. We have to understand that foreign policy is something you do with your friends, not to your friends.
Let's go to Ryan Maya. Ryan, can you hear us? Can you join us?
Hi, thank you so much for your time. Dr. Haass, one of the things, I'm in AmeriCorps Vista and studied international affairs, and something I've been thinking sort of recently is about thinking globally but acting locally. And as you said, sort of domestic politics, especially in America, really have such a strong influence on our international agenda and the world's international agenda. And so I was wondering if you thought there might be sort of a space for local political units or subnational units of governance in the United States to play a greater role in addressing global challenges. Just some examples I've seen or thought of, California and Canada have a carbon emissions agreement to sort of address climate change. We're seeing sanctuary cities in America address immigration issues, and also the pandemic response has illustrated how different states can have different takes. So I was wondering what you thought about that. Thanks.
Up to a point, but you're not going to have California with its own Navy, or you're not going to have Massachusetts with its own strategic nuclear forces trying to decide whether to extend the New START agreement with Russia come February of next year. Certain types of agreements can't be negotiated at the state or local level, and you don't want them to. It's important the United States speak with one voice. So again, I think there's things that states can do, yes, particularly in the area, say, of climate regulation. I think there's things that companies can do, very important. We were talking about global health, where there's a big role for biotech, for pharma, a big role for NGOs, groups like Doctors Without Borders and the International Rescue Committee. We're going to talk about how to regulate cyberspace. There's obviously an enormous role for the big tech companies. So I think there's role for non-state actors and cities and the rest, sister cities, all these other programs, but it's not a substitute. It's a complement for what has to happen at the federal government. If you look at the Constitution, you look at the Supreme Court decisions, there's real limits to what states are permitted to do. The idea is that there's only one foreign personality, to use the legal term, and that really has to happen at the federal level.
Right, and I'm actually going to combine some of the threads of questions that we've seen that come in. All things must pass. Every empire ends. No brand stays number one forever. So perhaps the preeminence of the United States in the world is coming to a close, and someone else will take the reins, or a group of countries will take that role. Can you talk about why you think it's important that actually America continue to fill that role?
Yeah, if I thought that there was someone else who was going to come along, who was going to play a large, responsible role, then I'd say maybe we partner with them or whatever, maybe even give way, but I don't see it. I think the real alternative to an American-led world is a nobody-led world. Mm-hmm. if it's these middle countries, the Canadas, the Australias, whatever, they just lack the heft. I don't mean that as an insult. They just don't have the power. They don't have the unity. So the idea that middle powers can somehow substitute for the United States is probably not viable. China, look, we've seen what China's doing. There's many aspects of Chinese behavior that are simply, I'll use a diplomatic phrase, unattractive. So we don't want a world that's defined by China or operated by China. So no, I don't see a real alternative. And again, what we've seen in the last couple of years is when the United States dials down, the turbulence in the world is dialed up. And that ought to be a warning. Look at the Middle East. That's an area where the United States, probably in the last 5 years, there's been the biggest change in the American footprint or role. I'm not saying, we may have been too large in many ways. I was critical of some of the things we were doing. But again, we got to be really careful about what we give way to. And what worries me most is anything sudden or dramatic is not likely to be a happy story.
Great, thank you. Let's go to a question from Jeff Simrot, who happens to be our friendly neighborhood board chair. Jeff, you want to join in?
It was good you called on him.
Yes. Jeff, are you with us?
Yes.
All right, great, Jeff, go ahead.
I am with I've been reading Daniel Yergin's book, The Prize, only 30 years too late, but
Yeah, it's a great book.
I'm reading it. So I have some questions. Is oil as important as it was, let's say back in the day, back through 1990 or 2000? If not, what do you think has or will replace it? And finally, to come back to China again, I saw recently that China made a deal with Iran on oil, which if oil is as important as it was, is a very interesting contrast to our reliance on or Europe's reliance on Saudi oil, and a very interesting alliance that China has made.
Couple things. Oil's still very important. Oil, gas, fossil fuels in general are still preponderant in the world. That will slowly dial down. Hopefully coal will dial down soonest and fastest. Hopefully renewables will dial up. Unfortunately, from an environmental point of view, from a climate point of view, nuclear is dialing down, which is unfortunate. But oil, for the next generation at least, maybe probably longer, yes, oil will be critical to the world. Where it's 2020, we're not going to be in a post-oil world in 2030 or 2040 or 2050 and so forth. So yes, oil is still important. What's different is, at least recently, demand has gone down, supply got bigger. So, but these things come and go, and we'll see about the future. If and when there's real global economic recovery, we'll see how much demand there is for oil, whether the producers in any way can limit the amount of supply in order to drive our price. We'll see. But yes, oil is important and will be important. I would guess now, I always get in trouble with statistics, but I'm guessing it's probably close to a third of the world's fuel, plus or minus. So yes, it ain't going away anytime soon. In the case of China, China's a major oil importer, and so it's always looking for sure places to supply. And what it likes about Iran is Iran needs places to sell its oil because of sanctions, and obviously China likes the geopolitical and possibly other entry that gives it. So again, it shows part of the problems of the United States pursuing a policy of unilateralism on Iran. Is it's very hard in this world to succeed with unilateral sanctions. We've actually gotten farther than I would have thought with Iran, in large part because the centrality of the dollar, the importance of the American market. But if you have powerful countries like China beginning to intervene and step in, it could create real problems for the United States as it tries to essentially muscle Iran using unilateral sanctions. Again, it's just a sign that this is a world that is getting it's so multipolar that I years ago started using the word non-polar. There's so many different actors out there who have power and have a degree of influence. So this is a harder world for the United States to corral on its own. Again, our big structural advantage, though, is we have allies and partners. We've got several dozen in Europe. We've got quite a few in Asia. To me, one of the great strategic flaws of this administration, it tends to see its allies often as foes or competitors rather than as natural partners.
Great. Thank you. Let's go to Raul Alcala.
Thank you. Following
Wow.
this recent
Can I just compliment you on your backdrop? That is really
that's
very
a
cool.
shot taken from diving in the Maldives a little over a year ago.
Love it. Room Raider would love it. That's
very
great.
international. My question is about international organizations, Dr. Haass. We have this plethora of these organizations. Some used, some not used. All of them come with a history, some would say, with baggage. So looking ahead for the next decade, regardless of whether it's Mr. Trump or Mr. Biden, what recommendations do you have about which organizations to especially pay attention to and use in an effort to internationalize, if you will, our goodwill and benefit ourselves as well?
You may or may not like my answer, but I expect it may surprise you somewhat. International organizations per se are not that important. They're no more important than the willingness and ability of countries with power to work through them. The sports metaphor would be the reason the Boston Celtics won all those championships was probably not because of Boston Garden or Garden. It was because of the Celtics. And my point is simply the housing of the effort is not important. And I would think in the future, what we're going to have to think about is not institutions necessarily, but more fluid arrangements. So give you an example. We'll take global health, just for one. I'll give you two. If the World Health Organization isn't up to the task, the question is, can we reform it? If we can reform it, then that'll be good. But the reform is not because the World Health Organization suddenly changes its ways. It's because the critical countries like China, the United States, and others agree on what the World Health Organization ought to be and how to ought to operate. And if they can agree, then it could do better. But if they can't, but if the major powers can't or won't agree, then we have to think about setting up some type of a new mechanism. Or for something like climate change, we have a mechanism called the Paris Agreement. The problem is, even if the Paris Agreement were implemented in full, it would barely make a dent in climate change. And it's not being implemented in full. So the real question is, are there other ways? And I would say, yeah, what you want to do is maybe bring together those countries which are most important and which are most like-minded. So, so I think we need to stop thinking about multilateralism as a version of the UN General Assembly with 193 or whatever the number is today, countries involved. That's lowest common denominator multilateralism. It's the reason the UN General Assembly is irrelevant. What we want to think about are designer approaches, where you get the entities, not even necessarily always countries, where you get the entities that are relevant, that are willing to act, that have power and so forth, and you get them in. They're like-minded, and you get them to do something. It may not be 100%, but if you can get, say, a dozen countries that represent most of the major economies in the world, that'll make a dent on climate change. Or if you can get the United States and the Europeans and some of the Asian democracies to agree on rules of the road for WTO reform, or what ought to be the rules of cyberspace, you won't get universal agreement. But sometimes 2/3 or 70% is a pretty good outcome. So I think we need to begin to think differently about multilateralism and stop. We shouldn't begin with the institution. We should begin with the policy and then say, how can we bring about the greatest pooling of effort in the direction of the policy we deem to be desirable? If we can do it through an existing institution, great. But if not, then let's give birth to something new.
Great. So in addition to sort of global topics, this book provides a wonderful sort of tour du monde of regional situations. And as you talk about, there really is no regional situation that does not involve the US. This may not be fair, but you provide us with a kind of chilling list of possible conflicts, possible wars even. Saudi Arabia versus Iran, India and Pakistan, U.S. Versus a breakout nuclear North Korea or Iran, NATO and Russia, or of course U.S. and China over Taiwan. So, in the middle of everything else that's going on with the virus, et cetera, which of these is most on your mind, or are they all equally urgent at the moment?
Well, I mean, look, they're all conceivable. The two that worry me most right now, and they say for the rest of this year, let's look at the short run.
Mm-hmm.
One would be the United States and China.
Mm-hmm.
This is a relationship that's going from bad to worse very fast. I can imagine an incident in something like the South China Sea. See, I remember in the first 6 months of the 43rd president's tenure, this is George W. Bush. So we're talking about 2001. You remember that an American reconnaissance plane crashed into a Chinese fighter jet, and that dominated U.S.-Chinese relations. But that happened in a context where things were pretty calm. Imagine that happened now. And given what's in the aftermath of closing these consulates and all that, so I worry about U.S.-China, some type of an incident there, possibly over Taiwan, possibly South China Sea. The other is the United States or Saudi Arabia or Israel and Iran. It could be a U.S.-Iranian incident at sea with our ships in the Persian Gulf. Could be some Iranian-sponsored terrorist group or militia that would target U.S. forces, say, in Iraq. Could be Iran continues to push the edge of the 2015 nuclear agreement, and Saudi Arabia, or more likely Israel, reaches the limits of its tolerance. So I would, if I were a betting man, those would be the two venues that I would see the greatest chance for something to start. And then the question is, can you manage it? Can you contain it? And that's a challenge to diplomacy and statecraft. And I wouldn't want to have that tested. Now, let me put it that way.
Thank you. Okay, let's go to Debbie Smith.
Yes. Again, thank you to you, Dr. Haass. And my question is really apropos of your earlier comments, but I may be putting like a time schedule on it or a scenario around it. And that is, per your comment about the current administration not being exactly global minded. If the current administration were displaced, would that instantly restore or help facilitate restoring American preeminence in the global sphere, and or not? And or would it require kind of a coalescing around, as you note, certain policies to do so?
No, it's a good question. And let me answer it in a couple ways. One is when you run for president, as we're going to see in a few days, you can choose your vice president. If you win, you can choose your cabinet. You can choose what you say in your inauguration. There's only one thing you can't choose, and that's your inbox. And so if Joe Biden were to win and take office in January, he is going to be greeted by shall we say, one of the most extraordinarily daunting inboxes domestically and internationally. So the idea of sudden changes, unlikely, with one exception, I'll get to that. Also, he's going to inherit a world where there's an awful lot of countries and entities with power, whether it's the Hezbollahs and Al-Qaeda's in the Middle East, or China, or Russia. So the United States may be the single most powerful country in the world, but we're not a hegemon. There's a lot of squares on that chessboard where there's local powers that are far more capable than us because they have geography on their side, or for them, it's the only square on the chessboard. They don't have to squirrel away a lot of resources for the other, for dozens of other squares on the chessboard. Plus, as I said before, whoever, the new president's going to inherit a country that is still going to be ravaged by COVID-19, I'm sorry to say. We're going to have tens of millions of people unemployed. We're going to be divided by politics. The election could worsen those divisions. We're going to be divided by race. And there'll be a lot of pressures on the administration to focus on the home front. So the idea that we're going to turn either the United States or U.S. foreign policy or the world around on a dime, no, it's not going to be that way. I think the thing that would change the quickest, though, is probably two things. One will matter more than the other. One would be the style of American foreign policy. If Joe Biden were to be elected, again, I'm predicting, projecting, extrapolating, whatever the word is, I think alliances and allies would be treated far friendlier. I think he comes from a tradition of American foreign policy where he does see allies as essentially ways where we multiply or leverage our position in the world. The problem will be that once you do that, translating the better mood in the rest into actual accomplishment in the world. And that's where you come up against what I was talking about, the big gap between global challenges and global responses. So what would we actually do about climate change? Or what would we actually do about regulating cyberspace or improving global health? I mean, so there might be a greater inclination to work together and get things done, but it's not going to be easy. These are really tough problems. We don't necessarily agree on everything. We'll never have everybody in the world lined up. And you have locals like in North Korea that can push back, like in Iran that can push back, like a Russia. We may agree more on what to do about Russia, but Russia's not going to get out of Ukraine the day after Joe Biden were to become president, if in fact he does. So I think we have to understand it's a very, very tough inbox, and the ability of the United States to essentially have its way. I think those days are largely over.
Okay. All right, thank you. Unfortunately, we're starting to run out of time. I wonder if we can do kind of some lightning questions. So let's go to Ed Martins.
I'd like to question, you talked about like there was no way to enforce, for instance, the WHO rules for China. What kind of enforcement would you like to see, or do you see that could be possible?
Enforcement's a bit strong, but I would, it's very hard to enforce it on a powerful sovereign state. We wouldn't much like it if certain countries in the world did certain things in us, but look, I would say the main things are naming and shaming. I would say sanctions are always a possibility. I think the best thing we could have done to put pressure on China, and this may surprise you, was have performed much better ourselves. Imagine how different the conversation would have been in China if people had seen that the United States had reacted and coped with this with real competence, and that the effects here were modest. And then I think you would have seen far more pressure from below on Xi Jinping. And it raises a larger point. In some ways, the best way to deal with China is to outcompete China. So rather than thinking all the time, how do we stop China, contain China, sanction China, why don't we just outcompete them? If we had outcompeted them on COVID, that would have had tremendous implications. If we outcompeted them on 5G, if now we were outcompeting them on everything, all sorts of things in biotech. And we have that potential. We've got the world's greatest universities. We've got pools of venture capital. Until recently, we had a great flow of talent from around the world, thanks to immigration. We did something about our educational system, about our infrastructure. I think a lot of the tools are there. If we restore traditional levels of federal spending on basic research. But that to me, so there's a place for sanctioning and criticizing China, God knows. But also there's also a place for just doing better ourselves.
Okay, let's go ahead to Irv Kempner.
All right, so you're going to get the nod when the election comes across to become the ambassador to China, given all of your knowledge of China. So knowing all the things that you know and all the things you said, and the fact that we have these issues starting with COVID, the lack of information. I don't know how much more we could have done, because there's an old expression that you're only as good as the information you have, and we got very, very poor information from China. We also are over-reliant from a PPE standpoint. What are the policies that you would be suggesting to the new administration that we do in order to become more competitive. To the points that you made, you can't become more competitive and outbeat them if you're letting them make everything for you, and if you're exporting your technology and all your manufacturing capacity. So,
well, the answer is I think we could have done a lot better, and we could do a lot better starting today. China's not preventing us from wearing masks. It's not preventing us from social distancing. It's not preventing us from contact tracing. So look, we can blame China for the fact the virus came to our shores. We cannot blame China for our response since then. That's on us. It's on the president. It's on the CDC. It's on the governors. It's on mayors. And look at the variation in this country. Look at how some of the New England states are doing. Rhode Island, Connecticut, New Jersey, New York now. And look at how Florida and Texas are doing. And again, there's variation of performance. And that's not China's fault. Look, there may be a case in certain areas that we want to produce or stockpile certain things because we think they're so important. Greater degree of self-sufficiency, less dependence on foreign supplies. That's fine. But again, what I said before, the real thing with China, I would argue, is to outcompete. China faces enormous challenges. They got a shrinking population. They got an aging population. They've got real environmental problems. They've got political problems. So China's not 10 feet tall. The real question is whether we will get out of our own way, whether we will do better domestically, and we will start working with rather than against our allies. First thing I would do is I would put the United States in the Trans-Pacific Partnership. 40–45% of the world's economies tell China, these are the standards you have to operate by or you won't have access to our markets. I would start with there. And I would go on from there.
Great. So as you can see, we've got a very curious group. Unfortunately, this is going to be our last question. Richard, you're here with us. So Richard Madden, go right ahead.
Okay. I want to reinforce the comment of Dr. Haass that the knowledge that American people have of the international world is really inadequate.
Okay.
And I think all of us in an organization like World Boston and all the other organizations that we may be members of, we need to contact our political representatives and let them know that we want this kind of education to be going on not only in secondary schools, but in elementary schools. So it's not really a question, but a comment, if anybody else wants to.
Okay.
But please, all of us, and Dr. Haass, you are the president of the Council on Foreign Relations, so that's a fabulous platform when you're interacting with people that,
Okay.
Let's try and have a groundswell.
No, look, actually, I'm glad you raised it. What we're doing at the council, we're well on our way to becoming the largest producer of educational materials for high schools and colleges to teach students, and also beyond high school and college, teach citizens about the world. It's available for free. It's on our website, cfr.org. I feel great about it. But look, think about what it costs to send a young person to a college or university, a private college or university. The most expensive now may be $70,000 a year, but others may be $30,000. Well, why aren't more parents demanding that in the course of getting this piece of paper that says you're a graduate, that it stands for certain things? Why aren't you saying I'll only send my son or daughter to a school that insists they take that? I'm surprised by how many parents are essentially passive about what constitutes the education that gives your child, your son or daughter, their degree. Same thing with high schools. I think parents and students ought to become much more of a lobby. No, a lot of schools are reluctant to define themselves. They're worried if they say you have to study X, people who don't want to study X won't go there. Well, fine. I think more schools have to be willing to say, this is what we think an educated young man or a woman must know. Whether it's about what we used to call civics, whether it's about the world, whether it's about STEM subjects, critical thinking, writing, speaking, you name it. But I would actually argue that, but as consumers, which is what we all are, either directly or through our children or grandchildren or whatever, as citizens, we ought to be more demanding about what is offered and what is required. at the high school and college level.
Okay. Well, on that note, unfortunately, we have to wrap up. Again, I'm going to give you, well, no, I guess I'm not on, but I would give you the visual of this book. We do have the link. You can buy it via the Harvard bookstore, and I encourage you to do so. It's really a terrific way to break down everything that we've just talked about. Just a reminder, folks, that we do have tomorrow's program on innovation ecosystems, disrupting the education space. And then August 5th should be something really different, a comedian from Israel talking about Hotel Corona in Jerusalem. So unfortunately, at this point, we have to say goodbye and thank you to Dr. Haass. Thank you so much for this really, really stimulating program. And the rest of us, hopefully many of us will go over to our second Zoom to chat. So thank you, Dr. Haass, for speaking with us, and thanks to everyone for joining in tonight. Have a good night.
Thank you. Be safe.